A Passion for Mushrooms by Chrononautical. Chapter 20. The Golden Light of Forge's Fire. Fili's forge was magnificent, as befit both a prince and a reward for facing down a dragon. There were great fires, smelting furnaces, molten metal, wide anvils, mighty hammers, long tubs of water, and many, many things that Bilbo could not put a name to, since he had no context for metalwork. However, he was curious and game to learn. Not to mention the thrill that came from once again actually making conversation with Thorin, instead of having his every question met with distance and unhappy silence. Clearly, Thorin loved his nephew a great deal, and made an effort to be present during their time together. Perhaps the excitement was too much for Bilbo, however. He may have gone overboard on the questioning.
"They're called tongues, Master Hobbit."
Thorin looked at him suspiciously.
"I have seen you use them in your own fireplace more than once."
"Ah, of course," Bilbo coughed.
"Thank you. My apologies, Thorin. I'm simply excited to see some dwarven magic."
"It is not magic," Fili said, with the tone of one repeating an admonition for the 20th time. "You will understand when you see. Uncle, I believe I've set up the mirrors correctly, but if you would care to double-check my placement before we get started?" Thorin's eyes went to the polished mirror on the ceiling, angled slightly as it was. Bilbo could see another mirror in its reflective surface. That mirror seemed to reflect another mirror at the base of a shaft along the southern wall of the forge. Beyond that, there seemed to be more mirrors. The chain must have led all the way out of the mountain, for Thorin said,
"If you could calculate well enough to catch the position of the moon, I will trust you to have found the sun at noon."
Puffing up at his pronouncement, as though it was finer praise than he ever thought to hear from his uncle, Fili began fiddling with an enormous set of important-looking glass lenses. "These should be ready as well," he said. "I have spent the morning cleaning them with acid and polishing them with my prepared sunstone powder."
"Good."
Thorin inspected a lens the size of a dinner plate very carefully. Whatever he found seemed to be fine, because he said nothing further. Simply set it down and watched as Fili attached it to the large metal bar that held the lenses in a long line. "They'll focus the light," Fili explained to Bilbo as he worked. "If I am going to catch sunlight in a stone, I want it to be good, strong sunlight. Otherwise, I might as well just trap moonlight or starlight. That is tricky enough, but at least never shatters the crystal or explodes in the forge." "Explodes?" Bilbo trusted Fili and Thorin, but that did not sound entirely safe.
"If a crystal is improperly prepared to contain the light,"
Thorin said,
"it will shatter under the pressure. If the smith is unable to gauge the amount of light the crystal can contain, it will explode. Fili has shattered 94 crystals, but he has only exploded 3.
Alarmed at this report, Bilbo took a moment to consider it as a dwarf would, in light of his own craft. Surely he had seen over 100 soufflés flop before figuring out how to get them to the table perfectly fluffed every time. This prospective failure only seemed dramatic because it involved very hot, possibly sharp things flying about the room at high speeds. "Perhaps I ought to stand behind one of the anvils," Bilbo suggested, "when the time comes." Laughing, Fili agreed. "Perhaps." Ruffling Bilbo's hair as he passed, the young dwarf went to pick up a large yellow crystal with 2 hands. Presenting it to his uncle with a little bow, he said, "This I readied last night." For the first time, Thorin seemed to disapprove of something he saw.
"Is this ready, my nephew?"
"Ready enough?" Fili said, sounding confused. Accepting the return of the stone, he held it up to his ear for a long moment, then ran his hands over it. He didn't seem to find whatever fault Thorin did. "The grain is light," he murmured. "There are no flaws." Fili kept mumbling to himself, slipping into Cosdal as he inspected the big crystal.
"Fili."
Thorin sounded exasperated, as though the lad was missing something very obvious. Fili looked up at his uncle. Then he blinked. "Oh, no! Uncle, I thought Bilbo would want to watch me draw the runes. We have a few hours yet until noon, so there is time."
"Ah."
Smiling warmly, Thorin looked sideways at the hobbit.
"Yes, there is time enough for you to fail at least twice."
"What? I never!" Bilbo stared at the king for a moment before turning to Fili. "I am quite certain that you will not fail at all, my prince, and I wish you luck in the attempt." With another laugh, Fili gave Bilbo to understand that expecting failure was a way for a dwarven master to relieve some of the pressure on a pupil. Being given time to fail meant being given time to get it right. "Besides, I probably will fail at least once. Runes are not easy. Apparently, this was a drastic understatement. Feely painted the runes on the surface of the crystal with molten gold and some sort of stone etching tool. When a phrase was exactly right, it would flash and mirror the image deep within the heart of the crystal. Bilbo refrained from asking how exactly this was not magic, because it was an incredible sight to witness, and he did not want to distract his friend. Dwarven craftsmanship often overwhelmed Bilbo with its scale. The great aqueducts that sent water both hot and cold to every room in the mountain humbled the copper pipes back at Bag End. Massive statues and stonework on such a scale that it had dwarfed Smog and made giants of dwarves were visible in nearly every hall within the mountain. They even had lifting systems, whole rooms that went up and down mine shafts so one didn't need to climb stairs and ladders every time. All of it was brilliant, impressive, and grand. Yet Bilbo rarely took the time to appreciate the work involved. He knew how hard the dwarves had worked on the plumbing and the sanitation systems, because a team of 20 had spent 3 days hammering non-stop in the royal wing to ready those apartments for use. He rarely took the time to appreciate that every hair in the braided beards of those massive dwarven kings was shown to be real as life. Even the lifts, marvelous as they were, he dismissed as part magic, part pulleys, and weights. He never looked closer. Bilbo had never noticed that for each and every golden light shining in the halls of Erebor, a patient dwarf had to sit for hours, carefully inscribing runes of molten gold in every single facet of a crystal. Feely was right. It was fascinating to watch. When the prince finally sat back with a sigh and gestured for his uncle to look at the finished product, Bilbo held his breath. Looking over at the crystal, Thorin traced the runes with his fingers, carefully inspecting each one. The care he took in this could not be overstated. As always, Bilbo admired the king's focus. When Thorin Oakenshield brought the full power of his attention upon an object, that object was laid bare before him. Bilbo was not jealous of Feely's magic crystal. That would be ridiculous. He was impressed when Thorin handed the big crystal back to his nephew with a nod. "No mistakes?" Feely asked hopefully.
Not to my eye.
Thorin gave the lad a rare smile.
Keep the brush. I have another.
Feely's hand tightened around the stone tool in his hand, and his face lit with a grin so broad it lifted the ends of his braided mustache to be level with his chin. "Thank you, Uncle!" Not wanting to interrupt the moment, Bilbo waited until Feely finally tamed his smile and turned back to fiddling with the crystal, setting it up on what looked like a white marble anvil underneath the many focusing lenses and mirrors. Then he asked quietly, "So that is how one gives such a gift? But I thought Feely was a craftsman, not an apprentice."
It is, and he is.
Thorin agreed amiably.
A master would not give him gifts anymore, not even while tutoring him in the finer points of his craft, but I am his uncle.
Feely looked up at Bilbo, his smile still bright in the fire-lit forge. "My uncle takes great pleasure in giving gifts, particularly, I think, since he need not fear my rejecting anything he chooses to give me." At Bilbo's side, Thorin stiffened.
Perhaps I have spoiled you, if you have grown into a dwarf who could speak so discourteously.
Feely seemed to ignore him, humming a little as he focused his lenses by tightening various screws. In response to this, Thorin's temper seemed to grow. Bilbo wondered if Feely had forgotten the original purpose of this outing in his excitement at being praised. The whole point of Bilbo coming to the forge had been to cheer Thorin up. Feely annoying the king was not part of their plan. 2 minutes! Feely cried, shifting the crystal a few degrees on its white anvil. "If you are to hide yourself, Bilbo, now would be the time. Although you must be sure to keep a good view. The light will be bright, but it shall not blind you." Looking around, Bilbo didn't see anything that seemed both sturdy enough to shield him and small enough that he could still see everything while standing behind it. Fortunately, Thorin put an arm around the hobbit's shoulders.
Stay by my side,
the king said.
If aught goes ill, I will keep you safe.
Leaning against the king was the easiest thing Bilbo had ever done. Even before Bilbo had found his own courage on their quest, he had always trusted Thorin to keep him safe if he could. Thorin would stand between his company and ravaging wargs, would leap from a mountainside to pluck a dangling hobbit, and he would always do what was in his power to keep others from harm. If Thorin, who knew the risks of what Feely attempted far better than Bilbo ever could, said that he would keep the hobbit whole, then that was more than good enough. Bilbo was as safe in the forge as he was in his own bed. Not to mention the warm, sturdy strength that radiated from Thorin's body like heat from the smithy fires. nor the fact that, possibly in deference to the heat of the forge, Thorin wore only a thin silk shirt. Bilbo could feel hard muscle underneath, and he could not resist pressing himself just a little more securely against his friend. Let Thorin think him afraid. If Bilbo were a burglar, there was no harm in stealing a short embrace. Then Fili pulled a lever on the floor, and light flooded the room, chasing out every possibility of a shadow, and Bilbo was astounded by its beauty. The beam that passed between mirrors and poured through Fili's lenses was so bright it looked like a physical thing, like Bilbo could reach out and touch it. As it traveled from lens to lens, it seemed to get brighter and thinner until it hit the crystal with a point as sharp as an ice pick, and a light as bright as the sun. Thorin's arm tightened around the hobbit, and neither of them moved. Slowly, the crystal began to glow. Then all at once it lit up from within like the flare of a match. Fili cried out in delight and pushed his lever the other way, cutting off the stream of sunlight. Frantically, the prince danced about his crystal, tapping it with strange tools, muttering puzzle words, and shoving the lenses out of the way. "Quickly, Bilbo!" Fili called out, not sparing the hobbit a single glance, but gesturing to a workbench close to him. "Bring me that golden stand! I want to set this as a table lamp!" Dashing over to the disc Fili indicated, Bilbo noticed that it was a little larger than the unfortunate golden medallion Thorin had given him. Not by much, just the length of his thumb in one direction, and maybe thicker by about the same amount. Regrettably, a single straw could overload a mule. No matter how he pulled, Bilbo could not budge the thing. "No, Bilbo, please, or the table be for naught!" With incredible strain, the hobbit managed to slide it toward himself, just a fraction, not nearly enough to bring it even to the edge of the table, let alone to Fili, who needed it. Finally, Bilbo's brain caught up with his panicked desire to save the project. "Thorin, help! I cannot lift it alone!"
"It is not so urgent as my nephew claims,"
Thorin said, walking over to the hobbit casually.
"The crystal is set. It will not explode, nor will the light be lost. Once again, my jester prince is having fun at your expense."
Hurt, Bilbo looked at Fili, who had the temerity to wink. "Really?" The hobbit was perfectly happy to be part of a joke, of course, but the prince was only amusing himself. Their plan had been to find a way to amuse Thorin. At least Thorin didn't seem to be upset by the teasing. Lifting the gold lamp base easily with one hand, the king brought it over to Fili. Bilbo couldn't quite see what passed between the two of them, but it must have been a very stern look indeed. Grinning cheerfully, Fili said, "Of course, uncle. My apologies, Master Baggins. I should have known that a hobbit could never lift such a great lump of gold, and refrained from embarrassing you publicly. Pray forgive me." Bilbo would have happily denied any embarrassment or need for forgiveness, except Thorin's eyes were wide. Bilbo could not read his expression. He looked surprised? Upset? Certainly he was upset. The king glanced from the gold in his hands to Bilbo and back again. The hobbit had known that Thorin would take the news that his Metham was less than perfect personally, but he hadn't expected the king to look so shockingly vulnerable. The expression made Bilbo feel quite disappointed in Fili. "I would have thought honor among princes a more trustworthy commodity," Bilbo said, his voice very cold indeed. "Bilbo!" Fili's voice was warm and cajoling, but the hobbit would not be won over. "No, my prince! I shall not hear a word of it. In the very hour of my need, I relied upon your repeated assurances of discretion, and here I find you making sport of my weakness." Thorin set the gold aside and caught Bilbo's hand gently with both of his. His hands were so calloused that it was surprising how light his touch could be. He was so close. Bilbo quite lost his train of thought, having Thorin standing so close, holding his hand so gently.
"Please,"
the king said. He did not look upset any longer, but he still looked strangely young. His eyes were still so very blue.
"My nephew did not mean to injure your pride or make a mockery of you. It is only that you are so very strong, scolding royalty, killing orcs, and facing down my sister. We forget sometimes you are not a dwarf. We think that you should be able to greet with the butt of a head, lift gold easily with one hand, or ride war goats like ponies. It is not right that you should need to keep reminding us. You do not need to forgive us, please, though know that we are sorry for it. We will do better given the opportunity, and if there is any amends that can be made, you have but to name them. We do not wish to hurt you."
"Oh, that is not... My pride is not injured at all. Of course I forgive you, Fili. I'm the one who's sorry, really. If I were not so stubborn, I would simply admit my failings right away." The smile that broke across Thorin's face when Bilbo said he forgave the thoughtlessness was far brighter than Feely's crystal. Even before the hobbit finished stammering out his own apology, Thorin enveloped him in one of those tremendous embraces where the king seemed to surround Bilbo completely with the cloak of his presence. Enfolded in Thorin's arms, Bilbo found himself forgiving Feely's little trick completely, especially when the king shifted and Bilbo felt the gentle scratch of dwarven beard against his neck. Swelling with love, the hobbit imagined he could even feel Thorin's lips brush against his skin. Not a kiss, surely, but something closer to it than Bilbo had ever thought to receive from the tall, handsome hero.
Thank you,
Thorin murmured against the shell of Bilbo's ear, as though Bilbo had been the one to give him a gift. Once again the hobbit considered the prospect of doing so. Some risks were worth taking. He could try to give Thorin a gift in the dwarven custom. The worst that could happen would be rejection, and if Thorin did accept a ring from Bilbo, if the king was willing to hear Bilbo's words, perhaps he could be tempted into a real kiss. Perhaps Bilbo could taste something so much better than black trilbies. Maybe even more. It just might be that Bilbo could offer something of great enough value to entice even a king into a courtship. He didn't have much, but he did have one very precious ring.